The Suez Canal Crisis, the 7-day war that broke the British Empire's bank. How do you win a war in 7 days and still lose your place in the world? Britain did. The troops moved fast, the airstrikes worked, the canal towns fell, and then the pound started bleeding. Here's what actually happened. A sterling crisis, a US dollar squeeze, and oil priced in a currency London couldn't print. I'm going to show you the hidden mechanics, IMF leverage, bond market nerves, and why one phone call mattered more than a battalion. The one call that ended the bluff, coming up. Let's set the board before it flips. The precarious post-war balance. Britain's sterling trap, 1945-1955. At the end of World War II, Britain looked like a victor on paper and a debtor in reality. The Empire's map still stretched across time zones, but its balance sheet ran through one fragile instrument, sterling. The sterling area, Britain plus much of the Commonwealth, pooled foreign exchange reserves and settled trade in pounds. That kept demand for sterling high and gave London a kind of financial gravity. But here's the catch. The goods they needed most, food, machinery, oil, were priced in dollars. Most people think reserve currency means freedom. In post-war Britain, it meant obligations you couldn't escape. In 1947, London tried to make sterling convertible, letting foreign holders swap pounds for dollars at will. It lasted weeks. Dollars rushed out as counterparties cashed pounds into the scarcer currency. Convertibility was suspended, and the lesson was straightforward. The world trusted sterling for invoices, not for savings, and certainly not against the greenback. The government took the hint, sort of, and leaned on the sterling area to keep using pounds while maintaining exchange restrictions to conserve dollars. It worked, until it didn't. The Marshall Plan papered over the gap. US aid funneled dollars into Europe, and Britain received a large share. That eased rationing and restarted industry, but it also masked a structural problem. Britain's export machine couldn't earn enough dollars to pay for essential imports at pro-war living standards and defense commitments. The dollar gap became shorthand for a strategic dependence. Economic recovery required American liquidity, directly or indirectly. By 1949, the numbers forced a public sacrifice. Sterling was devalued from $4.03 to $2.80. Devaluation helped exports on price, but it dented credibility. Investors now understood that sterling was an adjustable promise. And once you signal that a currency protects employment first and external value second, the market watches your policy mix like a hawk. Meanwhile, British recovery was rationed. Bread had been rationed after the war, meat, petrol, and coal allocations dragged on. The government prioritized rebuilding industry and paying for a global military presence across Germany, the Mediterranean, and Asia. Defense spending wasn't just a budget line, it was a statement of status. But budgets have a way of exposing fantasy. Every pound spent on garrisons and carriers was a pound not spent on modernizing factories to close the productivity gap with the US. Oil turned the sterling trap into a pipeline problem. The Middle East provided cheap crude. British companies had long-term concessions. Tankers fed refineries in Europe. But oil was priced or settled in dollars, and shipping insurance, spare parts, and many capital goods were dollar-linked too. The Suez Canal sat in the middle of this logistics flow, a shortcut that turned time into cash flow. When crude flows smoothly, your reserve drain is manageable. When they hiccup, your dollar bill rises quickly. Bond markets saw the strains before the headlines did. Gilt yields ticked up when import bills widened the current account deficit or when defense outlays spiked. A country that promises both full employment at home and a global military footprint abroad will either raise taxes, borrow more, or inflate. Britain tried a bit of each, but investors aren't fooled by labels. They watch the arithmetic. As reserves wobbled, the Bank of England defended the peg, spending scarce dollars to keep sterling steady. Each intervention solved the day and sharpened the long-term question. The sterling area itself was a mixed blessing. It created captive demand for sterling, which let London run deficits inside the bloc. But it also meant that if confidence cracked, the liabilities were concentrated. Think of it like a bank with loyal depositors, right up until rumors start. In 1947, the rumor became reality. In the early 1950s, the system held, but it remained brittle. Convertibility was postponed because everyone knew what would happen if it returned too soon. A run, again. Then there's the politics. Britain's leaders understood the optics. The empire's image underpinned the pound, but the causality was reversed. The pound funded the image. When the Korean War flared, rearmament drove spending higher. Growth rose, but so did external pressure. The Treasury managed crises with tools that bought time, credit controls, import quotas, quiet talks with Washington, and occasional rate hikes. Time is useful if you're catching up. It's lethal if you're standing still. By the mid-1950s, exports had improved, rationing lifted, and living standards edged up. It felt like normalcy returning. Yet under the surface, the constraint didn't change. Britain still needed dollars to keep oil, technology, and certain foods flowing. It still owed the sterling area a safe, stable currency, and it still wore the costs of a global role. That's the sterling trap, power expressed through a currency that can't absorb a shock. Now add two facts. One, the canal wasn't just a waterway, it was a working capital accelerator for Europe's energy. Two, the Aswan High Dam became a geopolitical bargaining chip between Egypt and the Cold War giants. The balance held until one dam and one canal rewired the board. Nasser's gambit, from Aswan Dam to canal nationalization. Here's what actually happens when a mid-tier state plays its hand well. Gamal Abdel Nasser wanted the Aswan High Dam because water and electricity are power in a desert economy. The dam meant flood control, irrigation for millions of acres, and cheap hydro to industrialize. To fund it, he triangulated. The World Bank, the United States, and Britain dangled loans. The Soviets hinted at help if the West stalled. Most people think this was vanity. It was leverage. Whichever superpower financed the dam would shape Egypt's path for a generation. But the talks were brittle. Washington and London didn't just want engineering milestones. They wanted alignment on Israel, on communism, on regional bases. Nasser played for time, buying arms from Czechoslovakia in 1955 to break Western control over his military supply. That set alarms off in Washington. By July 1956, after months of mixed signals, the United States pulled the offer, the World Bank followed, and Britain went with it. Officially, it was about doubts over Egypt's finances and capacity. Unofficially, it was about Nasser's independence. Now, this is important because it created an immediate funding hole and a political opportunity. Nasser needed cash and a narrative. He had both within reach, the Suez Canal Company. The concession, dominated by French and British shareholders, still had decades left to run. Egypt had sovereignty on paper, but not control in practice. Nasser's calculus was simple. If the West won't finance the dam, nationalize the company, use canal tolls to pay for Aswan, and turn humiliation into defiance. On July 26, 1956, in Alexandria, he said the code word, de Lesseps, multiple times during a speech, Ferdinand de Lesseps being the canal's 19th century builder, signaling teams to seize the company's offices. Engineers and administrators were ready. Egyptian forces took control quickly. French and British managers were escorted out. Nasser announced compensation based on the company's recent share price. Legally, he claimed the right of expropriation with payment. Practically, he flipped control overnight. Why then? Timing was strategic. The Anglo-American withdrawal had just landed. The canal was operating smoothly, summer shipping was heavy, and Egypt had trained pilots and staff to keep it running. He also calculated that a dramatic but legalistic nationalization would divide Western opinion. Some would rage over property rights. Others would admit sovereign governments can nationalize if they pay. And crucially, he framed it not as a blow against navigation, but against foreign domination by a company born in the imperial era. His message to the Arab world was clear. Sovereignty wasn't a slogan, it was cash flow. Keep the oil in Arab hands, keep the canal in Arab hands, and you change the terms with London and Paris. In a region still nursing wounds from 1948 and colonial mandates, that resonated. Nasser's voice of the Arabs radio made it a movement. You can say no, and you can win. To London and Paris, the signal was a red line crossed. The era of concessions and quiet deals was over. If Egypt could rewrite a contract of this scale without Western approval, then every strategic asset in the Middle East looked vulnerable. British leaders talked about internationalizing the canal under the 1888 Convention of Constantinople, which guaranteed free passage. But that convention didn't give them the right to run it. They pressed for a conference, offered proposals, and warned of grave consequences. Markets heard something else. British assets were exposed to a leader who wasn't playing by old rules. Now here's where it gets interesting. Nasser promised compensation and kept the canal open. Ships kept transiting. That blunted the case for immediate force. If the waterway isn't blocked, is invasion justified? But beneath that operational calm sat a deeper break. Control was political power, and the revenue stream no longer answered to shareholders in Paris or the City of London. Egypt's plan was to escrow tolls, pay creditors on their terms, and divert the rest to Aswan. He also understood the West's constraint, law and optics in the United Nations. By nationalizing with a compensation formula, he made it harder to build an international coalition for military action. He bet that Washington, focused on the election cycle and wary of being seen as pro-colonial, would oppose force. That bet would shape everything that followed. Public outrage in London masked a more specific fear: sterling's exposure to a prolonged canal dispute and oil reroutes. Britain could threaten, posture, even plan. But if Nasser kept the canal technically open, time worked in his favor and against sterling. The trap tightened, and the clock started. Secret partners in a public crisis, the Sèvres Protocol. Behind the speeches and UN letters, London and Paris were already in a different room, literally. In late October 1956, senior officials from Britain, France, and Israel met in a villa in Sèvres, outside Paris, to design a war that wouldn't look like one. The goal was blunt: remove Nasser, restore control over the canal's operation, and reassert deterrence in the Middle East. But the method needed political cover that could pass in Washington and at home. That's where the choreography came in. Israel's role was the first domino. The plan called for the IDF to move across the Sinai toward the canal, creating a threat to international navigation. Within hours, Britain and France would issue an ultimatum to both Egypt and Israel to stop fighting and withdraw a set distance from the canal zone. The ultimatum was engineered to be impossible for Egypt to accept, because Israeli armor would be far closer to compliance than Egyptian forces. Once Egypt refused, Anglo-French airstrikes would begin to separate the combatants and secure the canal towns. It was intervention dressed as peacekeeping. Each partner brought different objectives and red lines. Israel wanted to end Fedayeen raids, break Egyptian rearmament, and shatter the Gaza-Sinai pressure on its borders. France, wounded by Nasser's support for Algerian rebels and protective of its Suez stake, wanted regime change in Cairo, or at least a crushing demonstration. Britain's leadership, especially Prime Minister Anthony Eden, talked in terms of Nasser as an aggressor who must be stopped, often invoking parallels to appeasement. But the British Treasury and the Bank of England weren't in that villa. Their red lines weren't about tanks, they were about reserves. The Sèvres talks tried to solve for deniability. No formal tripartite treaty would be shown. Notes would be minimal, signatures ambiguous, and public statements would tell different stories in London, Paris, and Tel Aviv. Even inside the British government, the circle was tight. Many ministers and officials were kept out of the detailed operational pact. That secrecy was a political shield, but it created market risk. If the operation looked staged, and the timing would make it obvious, credibility would suffer in Washington and in the city. Now, this is important because plausible deniability works only if the audience wants to believe it. Eisenhower's administration didn't. The US had warned against using force and pushed for an international solution that acknowledged Egypt's sovereignty while protecting free passage. American diplomats could read the sequencing as well as anyone. An Israeli thrust, followed by a hair-trigger Anglo-French ultimatum, would not look like an accident. The Sèvres calculus underestimated how far the US would go to enforce that line, financially. Inside Sèvres, the partners mapped the clock. Israel would strike first, preferably around late October, when US attention was on the presidential election, but not so close that the fallout would land in voting week. The British and French would mobilize carriers and paratroops, pre-position aircraft in Cyprus and Malta, and prepare civil affairs units for Port Said and Ismailia. The air plan emphasized destroying Egypt's air force on the ground to minimize casualties and shorten the window. Speed mattered for two reasons: limit diplomatic blowback and keep markets from having time to panic. But here's where it gets interesting. The risk register focused on Arab retaliation, Soviet bluster, and UN condemnation. The financial column, sterling exposure, dollar liquidity, and oil insurance, got less weight than it deserved. French leaders believed they could ride out shocks. Their dollar liabilities were smaller, and they were more insulated by colonial currency controls. Israel expected the operation to be short and decisive, then shift to US-mediated diplomacy. Britain, however, was the hinge. It relied on confidence, not capital controls, to keep sterling stable. That made timing a weapon against London. The partners also bet on Eisenhower blinking before the election. The theory went like this: a Middle East oil shock is bad politics, so Washington would quietly accept a quick fait accompli if the canal remained physically intact. Restore order, present a new regime, or at least an international authority, and let the dust settle. It sounded neat in a briefing. It ignored the administration's Cold War logic, allowing allies to topple a neutral leader by force. In the week, America touted a rules-based order, undermined the narrative with non-aligned states from Asia to Africa. Ike's team prioritized credibility over convenience. Political cover at home was a separate track. In London, Eden framed the impending action as protecting international rights and averting a wider war, language designed to keep moderates on side and to erase the word collusion. In Paris, the message leaned harder: Nasser, the Algerian rebellion, and national prestige. In Israel, the pitch was security, ending a siege economy and opening the Straits of Turin. Each story held pieces of the truth. None admitted the choreography. And there was a quiet misread about markets. The assumption was that a short operation would calm shipping, reassure insurers, and restore normal oil flows. But markets don't only price physical disruptions, they price political sustainability. If the United States withheld support, dollars, IMF influence, and quiet interventions in currency markets, the financial cost of even a clean tactical win could spiral. That scenario was barely gamed out in Sèvres. The protocol sealed the plan. Israel would go on October 29. The ultimatum would follow. Airstrikes and drops would secure the canal zone within days. Then a manufactured pause for diplomacy. On paper, it was a ladder up and a ladder down. In practice, it was a trap with two springs, one in Cairo, the other in Washington. The plan unfolded on schedule, the markets didn't. Operation Musketeer, the 7-day military victory. Once the Sèvres choreography was set, the first move came fast. On October 29, 1956, Israeli paratroopers dropped near the Mitla Pass, while armor pushed across the Sinai from the Negev. The goal was Cairo. It was to unhinge Egyptian positions, cut roads, and force the air war onto Israel's terms. Within hours, the Israeli Air Force was flying suppression missions, and by the next day, Egypt's forward units were in retreat, many falling back in disorder toward the canal zone. Now, this is important because the timing triggered the second act. On October 30, London and Paris issued their ultimatum, demanding both sides withdraw from the canal area that Egypt physically controlled. The deadline was short by design, and when Cairo refused, the Anglo-French air campaign began. The stated aim: separate the combatants and protect navigation. The operational aim: destroy the Egyptian air force on the ground and clear a path for amphibious and airborne landings. British and French pilots hit airfields at Inches, Almaza and Cairo West, among others. The plan prioritized runway cratering, fuel depot strikes, and aircraft revetments. Within the first wave, Egypt's MiG-15s and Il-28 bombers were pinned, many wrecked before they could get airborne. That air supremacy changed everything on the ground. When you control the sky, logistics accelerate and nerves fray on the other side. The maritime peace moved in parallel. Task forces centered on British carriers, Eagle, Albion and Bulwark, plus French assets, took station off Egypt's coast. Naval gunfire was prepared but used sparingly. Optics mattered. The real thrust was airborne. On November 5, British paratroopers from 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, dropped onto El Gamal airfield outside Port Said, while French paras from the 2E Rep landed in the city. Street fighting followed, short, sharp, and costly in places, but coordinated air cover and naval spotting kept momentum with the attackers. Here's where it gets interesting. The canal seizure mechanics required a narrow dance. You had to secure Port Said and Ismailia quickly, avoid catastrophic damage to the locks, and avoid sinking ships in the channel. The planners believed a rapid lodgment, followed by a thrust south along the canal's western bank, could box Egyptian units away from the waterway. But war rarely follows a diagram. Egyptian forces, though outmatched, fought hard in the urban zones, using barricades and sniper fire to slow the paratroopers. Civilian density raised the political temperature and the risk of images that would play badly abroad. November 6, amphibious landings brought in Royal Marines and French Marines, expanding the perimeter. Armor rolled off LSDs, and the advance began down the canal road. Tactically, it worked. The casualty ratios reflected the asymmetry. Anglo-French forces took relatively light losses compared to the Egyptian units they engaged, and equipment losses were modest. Air cover pummeled any concentration that tried to regroup, and logistical lines from Cyprus and Malta kept supplies flowing. But the clock was loud. Every hour of success on the ground widened the diplomatic firestorm. The United States pushed for an immediate ceasefire at the UN, the Soviets threatened loudly, and non-aligned states rallied behind Egypt's sovereignty argument. More quietly, the money markets were reading the political tape. The faster Port Said fell, the faster sterling slid. It wasn't causation through combat, it was causation through credibility. The commanders felt the squeeze in real time. Orders came with caveats. Take ground, but minimize damage to the canal infrastructure. Press forward, but be ready to pause if a ceasefire hits mid-operation. That's a strange way to fight, moving aggressively while bracing for a whistle you don't control. Still, within 7 days of the first Israeli move, the battlefield scoreboard looked decisive. Sinai mostly under Israeli control, the northern canal zone in Anglo-French hands, and the Egyptian Air Force neutralized. Everything changes when your tactical win opens a second theater you can't bomb. Egypt scuttled ships in the canal to block passage, detonated charges in key spots, and guaranteed no quick reopening. So even a clean military seizure wouldn't restore oil flows fast. And the global spotlight was now fixed on the gap between stated aims, protecting navigation, and the reality of a staged intervention. By the evening of November 6, a ceasefire order was accepted. Troops who trained for a dash to Ismailia were told to hold. The commanders could count secured intersections and captured depots. What they couldn't count were dollar reserves leaving London by the minute. Militarily, Operation Musketeer delivered exactly what its designers promised: a swift, contained victory with limited losses and command of the field. Strategically, it triggered the one battle Britain couldn't win with jets and marines: the run on its currency. Oil stops flowing, the economic shockwave. The first real shock wasn't on a map, it was in the water. As the airstrikes started, Egyptian authorities ordered obstruction teams to work the canal. Crews scuttled tugs and old freighters at choke points, dropped cranes into approaches, and wired key sections for demolition. Within days, the channel wasn't just dangerous, it was impassable. That single move flipped Europe's energy math. The canal carried a third of Europe's oil in peacetime. Shut it and everything slows, reroutes, and gets pricier fast. Pipelines were supposed to be the relief valves. They weren't ready. The IPC line from Kirkuk and the tap line from Saudi Arabia to the Mediterranean had bottlenecks and political friction along their routes. Capacity couldn't absorb a sudden 2 million barrel per day shortfall. Tankers had to swing around the Cape of Good Hope, adding roughly 2 weeks to a voyage. Time is money in shipping, and in oil it's also storage, financing, and refinery scheduling. Miss your slot and your refinery sits idle. Hit it late and you pay penalties. Those delays didn't just raise costs, they cascaded through inventories and production plans. Now, this is important because oil pricing lived in dollars. Even British-controlled oil, even contracts run through London, settled against a dollar benchmark. So every extra day around the Cape multiplied not in pounds, but in greenbacks. Britain couldn't print the currency it needed to keep the lights on. Traders knew it. The squeeze wasn't just supply, it was currency mismatch. Each diverted cargo was a bigger dollar bill hitting a thinner pile of reserves. Insurance made it worse. Lloyd's underwriters repriced war risk overnight on eastern Mediterranean routes and Egyptian coastal waters. Reinsurance partners, many with US links, tightened terms or paused exposure until they saw political clarity. Premiums spiked on ships, on cargo, and on ports designated as risk zones. Even vessels going the long way saw rate bumps because the voyage length increased exposure days. Companies with thin margins simply stopped booking runs, waiting for rates to stabilize. That pulled tonnage out of the system and amplified the shortage. Freight exploded. The tanker market went from comfortable to tight in a week. Charter rates climbed as owners demanded compensation for longer voyages, higher war risk, and uncertain port access. Older T2 tankers that struggled to find work months earlier were suddenly back in demand. Refiners with long-term charters breathed easier. Everyone else scrambled for spot capacity at painful prices. And since charter contracts were dollar-denominated, the cost increase fed straight into sterling's external bill. On the ground, governments started doing math the public wouldn't see for a few more days. The Board of Trade and the Ministry of Fuel and Power ran scenarios: refinery throughput, electricity load peaks, industrial coal stocks, and how much fuel switching the grid could tolerate. A winter spike was coming. Oil-fired power stations and gas plants needed priority over private motoring. Rail had to get coal moving faster to backstop electricity. The message to Cabinet hardened. Without rapid normalization, rationing isn't a talking point, it's a timetable. Industry felt it quickly. Chemical plants relying on naphtha feedstock trimmed runs. Steel mills that had integrated all-fired systems planned slower shifts. Airlines put out notices of schedule adjustments as jet fuel allotments tightened. Trucking firms faced diesel allocations and higher prices, which fed into wholesale goods. Inflation pressure wasn't hypothetical, it was showing up in invoices. And all of it whispered the same thing to currency traders. Britain's external position just got weaker. But the canal itself wasn't the only choke point. Port congestion at the Cape and in Western Europe created new costs. Ship queues lengthened at bunkering stations. Tug and pilotage services were overstretched. Storage tanks near receiving refineries hit limits, forcing some cargoes to wait offshore. Every hour at anchor was an interest clock ticking. Letters of credit rolled over, banks charged extension fees, and small importers struggled to secure trade finance without raising collateral. Credit tightened in the real economy, then echoed into the money markets. Here's where it gets interesting. The UK's oil majors, BP, Shell, had global networks and could shuffle cargoes, but they weren't charities. They protected their balance sheets, prioritized hard currency earnings, and complied with quiet signals from Washington and The Hague about market stability. That meant the US and Dutch refineries got preference where contracts allowed, and surplus barrels didn't magically appear for Britain. The national story was unity. The corporate story was fiduciary duty. Meanwhile, Egypt's move to keep the canal formally under safe navigation rhetoric didn't matter. A blocked channel is a blocked channel. Salvage would take months. That took the wind out of the Anglo-French public rationale, protecting passage while doing nothing to relieve Europe's energy crunch. And because the obstruction was obvious, insurers and banks treated the risk as real, not speculative. They priced it in and moved on. By the end of that first week, the policy menu in London got narrower. Draw more dollars from reserves to pay the oil bill. Yes, but the drain accelerates. Tap the IMF. Possible, but strings and optics ahead. Ask Washington for emergency oil and foreign exchange support, politically costly and uncertain. Or impose rationing, tighten credit, and hope the storm passes before markets force a devaluation discussion. None of those options paired well with a prolonged military operation. Shortages hurt factories and voters, but the decisive choke point sat in the FX ledger. Oil shocks convert quickly into dollar demand, and if you fund your power with someone else's currency, your war is now their decision. The guns were still warm, in Port said. In London, the balance sheet was already cold. Eisenhower's financial squeeze, levers, not bombs. From Washington's perspective, this wasn't about tanks. It was about rules, oil, and credibility with the non-aligned world. So the response came with a smile and a spreadsheet. The first lever was simple: no emergency dollars. British officials floated requests, quietly, for short-term support from the Federal Reserve, Export-Import Bank credits, or a swap line to steady sterling. The answer, couched in polite language, was no. Without that umbrella, every trader knew the storm would keep hitting the pound. Now, this is important because the US didn't need to announce anything. It just had to not show up. The very absence of the Fed in the market told dealers that the floor under sterling was thinner than usual. In normal crises, allies step in with swaps, oil releases, or quiet bond purchases. This time, doors stayed closed. The State Department backed that stance with disciplined talking points: support a UN process, oppose aggression, maintain oil stability. Translation for markets: Washington won't spend political or financial capital to save a currency sliding for reasons it warned against. The IMF became the second lever. Britain had quota access, yes, but drawing heavily without conditions was off the table. American influence at the fund meant any large tranche would be tied to de-escalation and a credible plan to stabilize external accounts. That didn't require a press conference. It required a few conversations in New York and a memo to the managing director. London understood the message. Dollars would come with strings, and one of those strings was stop the operation and accept a ceasefire framework. The third lever was the quietest and most effective: signaling to oil majors and banks. US officials didn't need to order companies to do anything. They reminded them of regulatory scrutiny, tax positions, and patriotic optics in an election season. Banks heard, tightened credit terms on trade finance linked to the region, and nudged up haircuts on sterling collateral. Oil companies heard, prioritized US and domestic stability, and avoided steps that would look like subsidizing a contested war effort. None of this was a ban. It was a headwind. Multiply that across dozens of institutions, and you get a gale. Then came foreign exchange. The Treasury and the Fed had a toolkit of moral suasion and market presence. They didn't deploy it for sterling. Dealers who might have expected a US-led stabilizing bid saw volatility instead. A widening forward discount, higher swap points, and counterparties asking for dollar settlement right now. Banks with euro-dollar exposure to British names shortened tenors. Trade credits rolled only at higher rates. It was death by 1,000 repricings. Election year calculus sealed it. Eisenhower, running for a second term, had no interest in a domestic oil shock or a global crisis that looked like America enabling colonial rollback while condemning Soviet moves in Hungary. That contrast mattered. On one side, Washington was denouncing tanks in Budapest. On the other, two allies were toppling a regional leader under legal pretense. Ike's team saw a credibility gap that would haunt US policy in Asia and Africa. So they chose consistency: uphold the UN process, deny financial lifelines, and force a diplomatic reset. Everything changes when insurers get the same memo. US-linked reinsurers narrowed appetite for war risk layers touching the Eastern Med. Without reinsurance, Lloyd's syndicates either cut lines or pushed premiums up again. Shippers faced higher capital tied up per voyage, and banks asked for larger guarantees. That took marginal players out of the market and concentrated flows with the biggest, most conservative firms, exactly the ones most sensitive to Washington's tone. There was also a signal through the bond market. American institutions trimmed gilts, not because they feared default, but because headline risk and currency risk made the math ugly. Even small reallocations mattered because they pushed long yields higher and raised Britain's refinancing cost at the worst moment. The Bank of England could defend the currency or yields, but not both indefinitely. Defend both, and reserves vanish. Now, you might be thinking, why didn't the US offer a face-saving bridge, then extract concessions later? Because the leverage was highest in the moment of need. Once troops dug in along the canal and a de facto occupation took hold, every day would normalize the new facts. That's precisely what Washington wanted to avoid. So the timing was surgical. Squeeze before consolidation and make the choice binary. Withdraw and get help, or persist and face the market alone. Diplomatically, the US covered its pressure with multilateral language. It backed emergency sessions at the UN, supported resolutions calling for ceasefire and withdrawal, and floated the idea of a UN force to separate combatants. That gave London a ladder down without the label capitulation to Iran. But in private, the conditions were clear. Stop operations, accept international supervision, and we'll discuss IMF access and energy coordination. Ignore that, and we're out. One more lever rarely gets mentioned: settlement systems and correspondent banking. US banks were central in dollar clearing. A slight slowing of confirmations, a request for additional documentation, a stricter interpretation of credit policies, all nominally neutral, created friction for British banks trying to roll over short-term dollar liabilities. Friction costs money. In a thin reserve environment, those basis points add up fast. By the end of that week, London could read the board. No Fed backstop. IMF dollars behind a political door. Oil majors prioritizing stability over favors. Banks shortening exposure. Insurers hiking risk premia. And a US president signaling through every channel that mattered that this wasn't his crisis to fix. The message landed. The battlefield wasn't the decisive theater. The balance sheet was. The sterling crisis erupts. Panic, pricing, and policy. Markets don't wait for communiques, they front-run them. The first sign wasn't a headline, it was the forward market. Sterling's forward discount widened as dealers demanded more dollars to hedge near-term exposure. That's code for, we don't trust the peg at today's price. Spot followed. The Bank of England sold dollars into the slide, but each intervention only proved two things: reserves existed, and they were finite. Now, this is important because pace kills. In a matter of days, the reserve drain accelerated from uncomfortable to alarming. Gold and dollar holdings fell as the bank leaned on its standard defenses. Tightened sterling liquidity at home, hike bank rate to sweeten the carry for holders, and jawbone about temporary disturbances. Traders heard the subtext. If interest rates are doing the talking, the currency is doing the bleeding. The sell-off broadened from hot money to cautious institutions trimming exposure, just in case. Gilt yields told the second story. As sterling wobbled, long-term rates ticked up. That wasn't default risk. It was refinancing risk and inflation risk being repriced. A government financing defense outlays, higher import bills, and potential rationing looks like a borrower with worse options. Higher yields feed back into the budget arithmetic, which investors then use to justify higher yields. It's a loop, negative and fast. The bank faced an ugly triage. Defend sterling with dollars and hope confidence returns. Defend gilts with open market purchases and risk signaling monetization. Or defend the banking system's liquidity and let the exchange rate take more of the strain. In a fixed-rate world, you can't do everything. So Threadneedle Street chose the orthodox play. Support the currency first, keep money tight, and buy time for a political break. Time, again, was a shrinking asset. Capital flight wasn't dramatic on the street. It was clinical in the pipes. Eurodollar banks, many in London but clearing in New York, shortened the tenor of their placements to British counterparties. Trade credits for importers rolled only at higher rates and lower size. Multinationals swept cash to New York subsidiaries. Commonwealth treasuries quietly diversified a slice of their sterling reserves into dollars, using commercial banks to avoid calling attention. Each move was modest. Together, they were a run in slow motion. Here's where it gets interesting. The channels that matter aren't just headlines and bond auctions, they're settlement cycles and margin calls. As insurers repriced risk and freight costs stayed high, letters of credit needed bigger cushions. Banks demanded more collateral for dollar lines, and those collateral pools were often sterling assets. Mark them down, and you either post more or sell something. Selling begets selling, which deepens the discount on sterling paper, which raises margin calls. That mechanical spiral doesn't care about speeches. The government's emergency toolkit came out on the table. Capital controls. They existed in partial form, but tightening them further risked signaling panic and choking trade flows that earned what few dollars were still coming in. Import quotas, politically ugly and slow to bite. A one-off devaluation. It would save reserves in the short run but torch credibility, spike domestic inflation through import prices, and hand Nasser a propaganda win. A coordinated IMF draw. Possible, but Washington's conditions were sitting in every conversation. Each option was costly. The least bad one depended on ending the military clock. Inside cabinet, the briefings got blunt. Daily reserve sheets showed a glide path measured in weeks, not months, if markets kept pressing and oil bills hit at Cape-lengthened terms. The Treasury's arithmetic emphasized the coupling. Each extra day of operations raised the probability of an external financing event. The bank added a warning about cover, the ratio of reserves to the short-term sterling liabilities held by foreigners. If cover looked thin, the sterling area's confidence could snap, and then you weren't managing a sell-off. You were managing a systemic withdrawal. Policy signaling tried to get ahead of that. The bank rate went up to deter outflows and attract carry traders. The Chancellor floated language about meeting our external obligations in full and temporary measures to conserve foreign exchange. Hints at petrol rationing, framed as prudent planning, were designed to show discipline. But discipline at home doesn't refill the dollar tank if counterparties think you lack US backing. Everyone was watching Washington's body language. It hadn't changed. Dealers saw tells in microstructure. Bid-ask spreads on sterling widened. The bank's presence at key fixing windows looked heavier. Forwards beyond a month priced a steeper discount, implying expectations of either devaluation or policy capitulation. Cross-currency arbitrage that normally snapped mispricings back into line lingered longer because balance sheets were being guarded for year-end and headline risk. In plain English, the usual stabilizers were off-duty. The press caught up with euphemisms like pressure on sterling and volatility in gilt-edged. The public felt it through talk of fuel coupons and rising import prices. Corporate treasurers got calls from their banks suggesting they hedge more, sooner. That's not advice. That's the sound of risk being transferred back to clients. Exporters loved the weaker pound's implication for future competitiveness, but they also needed working capital lines priced in dollars to ship goods. A wobbling currency helps you on paper and hurts you at the bank desk. Emergency coordination meetings ran late. Could the US be persuaded with a face-saving path, UN cover plus a withdrawal schedule, to unlock IMF tranches and a temporary swap line? Could oil companies front-load winter supply if given tax relief? Could the bank raise rates again without snapping the mortgage market? Every answer looped back to the same junction: end the operation or accept the financial consequences. Markets had made the choice binary. By the end of that week, the sterling crisis wasn't an abstract risk. It was a lived reality in pricing screens and reserve ledgers. Panic was professional, not theatrical. Shorten exposure, hedge harder, demand dollars now. Policy was reactive, not proactive. Defend, signal, and hope for a ladder down from the UN. And the price of continuing was written in forward points and gold ounces leaving the vault. Financial pressure traveled faster than paratroopers, and it was already behind British lines. London's dilemma: military momentum versus financial mortality. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. In Whitehall, 2 clocks were running, one on operations, one on reserves, and they were moving in opposite directions. Cabinet meetings felt like split-screen briefings. The chiefs of staff showed maps with blue arrows advancing. The Treasury showed a line chart sloping down, dollars out, confidence thinning. Winning at port said while losing in the money markets isn't a paradox. It's what happens when your power is cash flowed. Anthony Eden wanted to hold the line. Publicly, he framed the action as restoring order and protecting international rights. Privately, his health was shaky, and the stress amplified tunnel vision. He heard military momentum and believed political will could carry it. Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor, counted something else: days of reserves. At first, he'd sounded hawkish. The closer he got to the numbers, the more cautious he became. Arithmetic beats adjectives. Now, this is important because the operational plan had a built-in assumption. Speed reduces political cost, but speed also front-loaded financial cost. Each additional day added oil bills, insurance premia, and FX hedging demand. The Bank of England's daily sheets suggested cover against short-term sterling liabilities was thinning to a level that would scare the sterling area if it leaked. If confidence cracked in Commonwealth treasuries, the run wouldn't be speculative, it would be structural. Costed scenarios hit the table. Option 1, push to Ismailia, secure the Central Canal, and declare a temporary administration pending UN arrangements. Military probability of success, high. Financial consequence, reserves down to a red zone within weeks if US support stayed off. Option 2, freeze at current lodgements, pivot to the UN, and negotiate a UN emergency force presence. Military morale, bruised. Financial relief, likely if Washington opened the IMF door. Option 3, dig in, impose tighter controls, ration hard, and try to ride out a winter squeeze. Political cost, explosive. Market verdict, likely devaluation talk within days. French ministers argued to keep going. Their exposure to sterling was lower, capital controls were tighter, and Algeria framed their risk tolerance differently. For Paris, withdrawal looked like rewarding Nasser and emboldening insurgents. For London, continuing looked like betting the currency on a battlefield that wasn't decisive anymore. Same allies, different balance sheets. The public narrative tried to hide the bind. Newspapers carried images of paras raising flags and naval aviators climbing from cockpits. Eden's language emphasized ceasefire conditions and international principles. But the private briefings were blunt. The United States wasn't budging, the IMF wouldn't draw without political movement, and sterling was pricing a bad choice. Victory abroad, vulnerability at home. Everything changes when backbenchers start calling the Treasury instead of the Foreign Office. MPs asked about petrol coupons, mortgage rates, and factory orders. Trade associations whispered that winter shutdowns would force layoffs. The politics of endurance lost altitude fast. You can rally a country around danger. It's harder to rally it around a basis point spread on 3-month forwards. Yet that spread was the war. The chiefs of staff added an awkward caveat. If a ceasefire landed mid-advance, they could hold what they had, but any stop-start would stretch logistics and raise casualty risk without delivering new bargaining chips. Military momentum wants a finish. Finance wanted a pause. Diplomacy offered a ladder only if London stopped climbing. Macmillan's arithmetic hardened into advice. He warned that reserves, even with gold sales, couldn't sustain both a defended exchange rate and prolonged operations plus oil at Cape terms. If the US wouldn't cover, the choice narrowed to 3: float or devalue and torch credibility, slam on capital controls and choke trade, or accept a UN-mediated ceasefire and unlock support. None tasted like victory. One avoided catastrophe. You probably think there was some secret back channel that could square the circle. There was Washington, and its condition was withdrawal. The bank reported that forward points implied a non-trivial probability of devaluation within a month if nothing changed. Traders weren't waiting for communiques. They were pricing what they saw. No dollar umbrella, rising oil bills, and a government talking toughness while borrowing confidence. Inside number 10, Eden pressed for leverage. Could a quick dash to Ismailia, completed before the UN vote, force a better settlement? The reply from the Treasury was dry. Even a dash accelerated the drain, and the UN timetable wasn't under British control. The reply from Washington via diplomatic cables was drier. Ceasefire now, or face the market alone. The reply from the bank, we can defend for days, not for narratives. The unspoken admission came out in elliptical phrases. External constraints, extraordinary pressures, international responsibilities. Strip the euphemisms and it said, Power is measured in dollars this week, not divisions. The older logic, hold the canal, reassure insurers, and markets will calm, died the moment Egypt scuttled ships and the US withheld support. Physical control without financial clearance was a Pyrrhic grip. Cabinet split sharpened. Some urged pushing through to present facts the world would have to accept. Others, led by the arithmetic, argued that the facts the world already accepted, dollar pricing, IMF leverage, and US clearing dominance, were the only ones that mattered. The decision path narrowed to a phone call and a vote at the UN. One more layer deepened the dilemma, the sterling area. If Commonwealth holders sensed a break in London's capacity to convert and settle, they'd diversify harder. That wasn't betrayal, it was prudence. London had run the area like a mutual confidence pact. Suez tested whether the centre could still guarantee the outer ring. The answer depended on Washington, not Port said. So London did something that feels paradoxical and was simply rational. It prioritized solvency over scenery. A ceasefire would mean political damage, French anger, and a narrative hit at home. But it would also mean the IMF door creaking open, oil coordination calls softening prices at the margin, and the forward discount narrowing. The balance sheet chose for them. One call could end it. Washington knew it. And Eden, after a week of maps and ledgers, did too. The phone calls and the climbed-in, how the withdrawal happened. When the maps and the ledgers finally collided, the next moves happened on telephones. The US-UK exchanges weren't polite metaphors, they were conditions. Washington's line was consistent. Accept an immediate ceasefire under UN authority, agree to withdraw, and we'll help unlock the financial support you need. Keep going, and you're on your own in the dollar market. No threats, just arithmetic. Eden and his circle worked the angles. Could they get a ceasefire that froze positions long enough to claim mission accomplished? The American answer was firm. Ceasefire now, withdrawal to follow, and international arrangements for the canal under UN oversight. To make that credible, the US backed a UN emergency force proposal. Peacekeepers who could replace Anglo-French troops and face Egypt while restoring navigation. It gave London cover. You weren't retreating, you were handing over to the international community. Now, this is important because the sequencing was the ladder down. First, a ceasefire resolution at the UN to stop the clock. Second, negotiations on a withdrawal timetable tied to UNEF deployment. Third, a canal settlement that preserved free passage and a compensation framework without returning control to the old company. The phone calls translated that into practical steps: halt airstrikes, pause advances, and prepare orders for a staged pullback. The offer on the other line was access, IMF drawings, coordinated oil shipments, and gentle hands in the FX market. Domestic politics needed padding. Eden couldn't say, "We're stopping because we're nearly illiquid." So the public script emphasized international responsibility, UN authority, and the need to prevent a wider war. The ceasefire announcement came quickly, November 6, framed as compliance with the UN and the protection of civilians. The word withdrawal was treated carefully, wrapped in phrases like subject to international arrangements. Inside Whitehall, the paperwork moved faster than the prose. The United Nations gave the choreography a stage. The General Assembly, bypassing a Security Council jam, pressed for a ceasefire and withdrawal. Canada's Lester Pearson emerged with the UNEF concept, and Egypt, eager to get foreign troops out, accepted peacekeepers on its soil so long as they weren't British or French. That detail mattered. London could say it was making way for the UN, not capitulating to Cairo. Washington, in turn, let it be known that IMF assistance would be considered promptly once compliance was real, not rhetorical. The market's verdict was instantaneous. The forward discount eased a touch on the ceasefire news, spot stabilized, then tested the bank's bids less aggressively. It wasn't relief so much as a pause in panic. Traders wanted to see ships move and timetables hold. The Bank of England, still bleeding reserves, saw a path. If the government stuck to the sequence, dollars would flow through official and private channels within days, not weeks. Timelines hardened into orders. Anglo-French forces began preparing for a staged evacuation of Port said. UNEF units, largely from non-aligned countries, assembled in the Sinai approaches. The British cabinet agreed on the talking points: respect for the UN, a guarantee of canal freedom, and the necessity of collective arrangements in a new world. The military chafed. Commanders argued that stopping mid-operation wasted leverage. The Treasury countered that leverage was priced in forward points, and they turned. Face-saving wasn't just rhetoric, it was choreography. The government stressed that Egypt must ensure free navigation under the 1888 Convention, that compensation would be settled under law, and that the UN force would verify both. That allowed a claim. Objectives met in principle, now entrusted to international supervision. The subtext was for Washington: we did our part, open the spigots. Messages crossed the Atlantic that IMF drawings could proceed, alongside quiet Federal Reserve cooperation on gold and currency operations, once withdrawals were underway. Implementation mattered. Ceasefire lines were respected. Demolition and sabotage claims were handled through UN channels. Ships were prioritized for clearance once salvage could start. As troops re-embarked, London's statements leaned on process, pending UN arrangements, with the concurrence of our allies, to safeguard international rights. Each phrase aimed inward at Parliament and outward at markets. The Soviets hurled threats, but their words weren't the decisive pressure. Settlement systems were. As Anglo-French units left the Canal Zone entirely in December, sterling stabilized further, and the bank saw room to ease its defense. Oil allocations were juggled through emergency committees, and rationing at home was introduced with an air of prudence rather than panic. Washington, satisfied that the climb down was real, helped nudge the IMF board toward approvals and dialed back the headwinds' whispers to banks and reinsurers. The lessons sat under the whole sequence: diplomacy for headlines, financing for outcomes. The phones carried both. When the ceasefire landed and the withdrawal began, it wasn't a confession of defeat on the ground. It was acceptance of the balance sheet's verdict. The guns went quiet, the dollars cleared, and an empire learned that in a dollar world, the cliff isn't a battlefield, it's a ledger. Aftermath in numbers, the bill for a short war. So what did a week of fighting actually cost? Start with reserves. In the weeks around Suez, Britain's gold and dollar holdings fell by hundreds of millions, enough to turn a currency defense into a countdown. The precise ledgers were confidential at the time, but the story was clear in the bank's daily cover ratios. Each intervention to steady sterling consumed scarce dollars, and each day of Cape-priced oil widened the hole. Britain drew on the IMF soon after, initially a standby in tranches that, in aggregate, ran into the high hundreds of millions over the following year. That wasn't bailout theater, it was oxygen. Oil imports told the second story. With the canal blocked and pipelines constrained, voyage times jumped and so did dollar bills. Winter brought rationing, petrol coupons returned, heating oil allocations tightened, and ministries quietly reordered industrial priorities. Refineries cut runs or switched slates, power stations leaned harder on coal. The direct budgetary cost, subsidies, logistics, emergency freight, was only part of it. The bigger hit was macro: more expensive energy, less output, and a squeeze that leaked into prices just as the government needed calm. Now, this is important because the crisis slapped a premium on sterling. Even after the immediate panic eased, gilt yields sat higher than they would have without Suez. Investors demanded compensation for political and external risk. Higher long rates filtered into mortgages and corporate borrowing, shaving growth in the next year. The forward market wrote the same message in a different font, a persistent discount that took time to normalize. A currency can survive a shock. It pays for the memory. Look at the line items that don't appear in the defense budget. Insurance premia, reinsurance gaps, and trade finance margins, all reset. Lloyd's underwriters didn't simply snap back to per-war rates when UNEF arrived. Reinsurers, especially those tied to US capital, re-entered cautiously. Banks kept wider spreads on letters of credit touching Eastern Med routes. Those basis points turned into millions across British trade. Temporary disturbance lingered as a surcharge. The Treasury's internal reckoning paired numbers with narratives. Reserve losses plus IMF drawings equaled breathing room bought at the price of policy autonomy. Oil import costs equaled a winter of rationing and a political bruise felt on every high street. The sterling credibility premium equaled slower growth, a few tenths off GDP that didn't make headlines but showed up in factory orders and housing starts. And the defense line. A swift, disciplined operation with limited military losses that, on paper, looked efficient. The contradiction was the point. Colonial signals were measured in capital flows as much as flags. After Suez, sterling area members watched London's cover more closely. Some diversified incremental reserves into dollars and gold. Central bankers in the Commonwealth didn't issue speeches, they placed orders. The city felt the shift. A system built on confidence now had more questions in every quarterly meeting. Decolonization wasn't caused by Suez, but Suez accelerated the belief that the center could no longer guarantee the periphery's convertibility on demand. Contrast that with France and Israel. France shared the military burden, but carried a different balance sheet. Capital controls were tighter, the franc's international role smaller, and Paris made different trade-offs, accepting inflation and structural strains in other arenas while prosecuting the Algerian War. The market's whip lashed London harder because sterling mattered more. Israel, for its part, paid a military price in operations and a diplomatic price in withdrawals from Sinai under US pressure, but it didn't run a reserve currency defense. Its vulnerability was security, Britain's was solvency. Equipment losses and battlefield expenditures, often the focus in war books, were rounding errors next to energy and finance. Aircraft sorties burned fuel. The true invoice landed when tankers rounded the Cape. Paratroop drops cost money. The expensive part was the forward points dealers demanded the next morning. That's the awkward arithmetic of modern power. The balance sheet dwarfs the battlefield. There's a final ledger entry that rarely shows up in accounts: opportunity cost. The rate spike nudged public spending choices for years. Less fiscal room for investment, a longer slog to modernize industry, and a tighter political constraint on any future independent action outside a US umbrella. Bond markets remember, cabinets adjust. So the bill for a short war came in 4 envelopes: reserves drained, IMF drawn, oil rationed, and credibility taxed. Britain won quickly on the ground and paid slowly in money. The numbers didn't shout, they compounded. And once they did, everyone, from insurers to colonial treasurers, read the same line at the bottom. The pound could no longer carry imperial weight at wartime speed. The empire's tipping point, from Suez to decolonization. When the dust settled and the dollars cleared, strategy, not sentiment, reoriented. Suez didn't invent British decline, but it set the pace. Overstretch, masked by imperial habit and sterling mechanics, was now visible to every finance minister from Ottawa to Accra. The logic of strategic retreat became not a choice but a plan. Cut liabilities faster than confidence erodes. Strategic retreat started with priorities. The chiefs of staff refocused on NATO's central front and the nuclear deterrent, areas where US alignment multiplied British power rather than draining it. Carriers and imperial garrisons looked glamorous. A credible contribution to NATO air defense and submarine forces looked solvency-friendly. Budgets followed that math. The 1957 Defense White Paper, leaning into missiles over manned aircraft, wasn't just technology talk. It was an admission that manpower-intensive imperial policing no longer fit the balance sheet. Commonwealth relations changed tone. For years, the sterling area had been a quiet pact: park reserves in London, settle in pounds, and trust convertibility at need. After Suez, that trust needed proof. London offered higher yields on sterling holdings, more transparent reporting on reserves, and friendlier trade credits. It helped, but the center of gravity shifted. Members diversified modernly, not dramatically: more dollars, more gold. London could still convene. It could no longer dictate. Decolonization timelines accelerated. Ghana, already heading to independence, became the proof that exit could be orderly and politically sellable. Malaya, where an insurgency had strained finances and manpower, moved toward federation and independence with urgency sharpened by the new fiscal reality. Kenya, with the Mau Mau revolt fresh in memory, entered a political process that just months earlier would have been slower. Suez didn't force the door. It took away the illusion that time favored delay. Now, this is important because doctrine followed money. The army's posture shifted from imperial dispersal to expeditionary contribution. Smaller, faster forces designed to plug into allied ops. The Navy rationalized. Fewer big-deck ambitions, more emphasis on anti-submarine warfare and North Atlantic commitments. The RAF's role condensed around air defense and the nuclear delivery question. Every doctrinal debate referenced two words that didn't appear on recruiting posters: reserves and dollars. Foreign policy recalibrated around Washington. After Suez, every major move got tested against one criterion. Can we do this without US financial or political cover? If the answer was no, policy either shrank or sought explicit American buy-in. That didn't mean subservience. It meant coalition as default, unilateralism as last resort. The next decade's crises, Berlin, Cuba, Southeast Asia, saw Britain opting for influence through alignment rather than proof-of-flag deployments it had to fund alone. Culturally, Suez lodged as the day the music stopped. The press learned a new vocabulary: sterling crisis, IMF drawings, balance of payments, and the public learned that aircraft carriers don't pay oil invoices. Political rhetoric softened from empire to partnership, from rule to responsibility. That wasn't moral awakening alone. It was accounting. A nation that had lived off invisible earnings, the city's services, maritime insurance, imperial trade finance, now had to make those earnings in a world where clients had options. Diplomatically, London worked to convert loss into architecture. The UN emergency force, whatever its limits, gave a model for multilateral peacekeeping. The Suez Canal Users Association, though short-lived, previewed consumer coordination on critical choke points. In Europe, Suez nudged Britain to look again at integration as leverage. Though initial applications stumbled, the long arc bent toward the European project as a scale multiplier for a mid-sized power. At home, fiscal policy absorbed the lesson. Chancellors treated the exchange rate as a constraint, not a symbol, and budget speeches smuggled strategy into spreadsheets. Prioritize export competitiveness, encourage industries that earned hard currency, and rebuild credibility through orthodox discipline. Devaluation remained a ghost in the room. It would return later, but Suez taught how high the political cost was when markets forced your hand. The empire's tipping point wasn't a single headline. It was a cascade of second-order choices. Governors who once asked for battalions now asked for development loans. Colonial offices that wrote about pacification began drafting constitutional timetables. The Treasury, rarely the hero in war stories, became the metronome of imperial exit. If it couldn't be funded at a tolerable rate, it couldn't be held at a tolerable cost. You probably think decline is inevitable after a global war. Sometimes, but pace matters. Suez turned a managed descent into a steeper glide. It told allies and adversaries where Britain's hard limits lay, and it told British leaders what every firm learns the hard way. Liquidity defines strategy in the short run, and the short run chooses for you. The quietest change sat in boardrooms and embassies. The city reoriented toward eurodollars, learning to make money from the system it couldn't control. Diplomats leaned into convening, mediation, and drafting, roles that punch above weight without burning reserves. The armed forces professionalized for alliance warfare, fewer flags on faraway posts, more joint exercises with American counterparts. Suez didn't end British influence. It ended the illusion that influence could be financed by nostalgia. From then on, power had to clear in dollars, pass NATO's filters, and survive the test of markets on Monday morning. That's not romance. That's durability. And it's how a former empire learned to be a modern state. Counterfactuals and myths. What if Britain had held? Let's test the bravado. Could Britain have simply held the canal zone and ridden out the storm? Start with capital controls. Tighten them hard. freeze non-resident sterling, clamp down on outward investment, ration imports. On paper, that buys time. In practice, it telegraphs desperation and hits the very trade flows that earn dollars. The sterling area depended on confidence that London would convert, slam the door, and Commonwealth treasuries diversify faster. You don't stop the outflow. You redirect it to the shadow channels and raise the political cost at home. What about an emergency devaluation? Cut the pound, make exports cheaper, ease the external gap. In a fixed-rate world anchored to the dollar, devaluation resets prices but detonates credibility. Import costs jump overnight, feeding inflation when energy is already expensive. The forward market would have read it as proof that Britain lacked US cover and pressed for another cut. Devalue mid-operation, and you hand Nasser a propaganda victory and lose the city's trust in one move. Now you might say, just ration harder and lean on the oil majors. Rationing was coming anyway, but rationing doesn't create dollars. It lowers domestic demand, while voyage times and war risk premia still swell invoices in greenbacks. As for BP and Shell, they had global obligations and US-linked financing. They could reshuffle barrels at the margins, not conjure capacity or override Washington signals. Fiduciary duty beats flag-waving when boards face regulators and lenders. Would US support have appeared after Election Day? That's the comfortable myth. Eisenhower's stance wasn't tactical, it was strategic. Allowing allies to topple a sovereign government under UN glare while denouncing Soviet tanks in Hungary would have wrecked America's position with the non-aligned world. The administration pushed UNEF for a reason. It created an exit that preserved the rules narrative. Post-election, the incentives didn't flip. If anything, with the vote secured, the White House had less reason to compromise. Could Britain have engineered oil workarounds, pipeline boosts, tanker pools, Cape convoys to survive the winter? Some relief was possible, and the US did coordinate emergency allocations once withdrawal was underway. But the counterfactual assumes those barrels would have flowed to a belligerent against US policy. The more London dug in, the tighter the quiet headwinds from banks, reinsurers, and majors. Physical logistics weren't the binding constraint. Financial clearance was. What about a faster, cleaner military finish? Dash to Ismailia, announce an international authority and dare the world to reverse it. Tactically plausible. But Egypt had already blocked the canal. Even with northern control, oil wouldn't resume quickly. The casus belli, protect navigation, looked hollow while wrecks sat in the channel. Markets price sustainability, not maps. Without US sponsorship, gilt yields stay elevated, forwards widen, and reserves drain. You deoccupy a symbol and bleed the substance needed to hold it. France's different experience tempts another myth. They endured, so Britain could have too. But France's franc wasn't a reserve currency, its capital controls were tighter, and Paris was already absorbing inflation to finance Algeria. London ran a convertible currency at the center of a payments area. That model required openness and trust. The same openness that magnified Britain's influence magnified the punishment when confidence cracked. Here's the harder question. Could a full wartime footing, controls, rationing, propaganda, have carried public opinion long enough to outlast the squeeze? Possibly for weeks, not months. But the Treasury's arithmetic didn't care about speeches. Oil in dollars, insurance in dollars, bank liabilities in dollars. Without a swap line, heavy IMF drawings, and cooperative reinsurers, you run out of room. And those doors stayed shut while troops advanced. The biggest myth is that military victory should decide outcomes. It decides terrain. Finance decides endurance. Britain proved it could take ground quickly. The US proved it could take oxygen quietly. In any plausible hold scenario, the decisive variable keeps returning to the same place, access to dollar liquidity at scale. Without it, every workaround is a shorter runway to the same cliff. So if Britain had held, what then? A longer occupation, a deeper sterling discount, a harsher rationing regime, and a forced choice between devaluation and an even more bruising retreat. The counterfactual isn't a hidden pathway to triumph. It's a louder, costlier version of the same ending, because the architecture of the system was the plot. The playbook revealed. How finance ends wars without firing shots. Let's make the mechanics visible. The first tool is liquidity denial. Wars burn working capital, fuel, spares, insurance, payroll, and settlement for imports. If your inputs clear in a currency you don't issue, your adversary doesn't need sanctions. They just need to sit on the spigot. That's what happened to Britain. The absence of a Fed swap line and the delay on IMF drawings were not theatrics. They were oxygen withheld at the right moment. Now, this is important because FX isn't just price, it's plumbing. Central banks defend parities by selling reserves and tightening domestic money. But defense only stabilizes if counterparties believe a bigger balance sheet stands behind you. Without that belief, every sale of dollars invites the next test. Markets always probe where the floor might be. Deny the floor and probes become a run. That's a liquidity weapon. Silent, deniable, decisive. Second tool, credit lines and settlement systems. Most trade moves on letters of credit confirmed by big banks. Most dollar payments clear through a small set of correspondent networks. You don't need to cut wires to slow a belligerent. You ask for more documentation, shorten tenors, raise haircuts on collateral, and suggest prudence to risk committees. A day's delay in confirmations forces importers to roll financing. Rolls cost basis points. Basis points compound into millions. Combine that with war risk premia, and you've turned spreadsheets into siege engines. The third tool lives in market microstructure. Forward points and swap lines are the heartbeat of cross-border funding. When forward discounts widen, corporate treasurers hedge more. When hedges get expensive, they defer capex, hoard dollars, or dump local paper to free collateral. Dealers widen spreads, balance sheets retreat, and self-insurance becomes the norm. This is how sentiment becomes cash flow. In Suez, the widening forward discount on sterling didn't just reflect politics. It forced behavior that made the politics decisive. Insurance and shipping are the fourth multiplier. Tankers sail on finance. If reinsurers narrow their appetite for war risk layers, primary underwriters at Lloyd's shrink capacity or hike price. Charter rates jump because owners want compensation for longer, riskier voyages. Banks financing cargoes demand bigger margins. Suddenly, even neutral cargoes cost more. For a country buying oil in dollars, that's a triple hit. Higher freight, pricier insurance, and more dollars per barrel. You can occupy a canal town. You can't compel underwriters to quote you a 1955 rate. The fifth lever is signaling. Officials don't have to issue threats. They place calls with phrases like prudential standards, year-end optics, and avoid unsettling markets. Executives hear the subtext. No one wants to be the bank that extended a headline-grabbing facility or the insurer that took a loss in a politically radioactive zone. This is soft power aimed at hard balance sheets. It's also reversible. Once behavior changes, pressure can be eased without a single public concession. Multilateral cover is the sixth piece. The IMF, World Bank, and UN provide neutral language to mask leverage. Stability, orderly adjustment, collective security. These phrases package conditions as norms. In practice, the message is simple: align with the process and liquidity returns. Defy it and you fund yourself alone. For Britain, UNEF and an IMF window arrived as a pair. One gave the story, the other paid the invoices. Seventh, expectations management. Markets don't price the world as it is. They price the next 10 days. If they believe a belligerent can consolidate facts rapidly, they'll tolerate volatility. If they believe consolidation invites larger retaliation, financial, diplomatic, or military, they'll sell early and ask questions later. Eisenhower's team made sure the second belief dominated. Any deep occupation would provoke ongoing dollar denial. Traders extrapolated and moved faster than ministers. Everything changes when you see how these tools interact. Liquidity denial makes insurers cautious. Insurers, caution tightens bank credit. Bank caution widens forward points. Wider forward points force corporate hedging. Hedging accelerates dollar demand. Rising dollar demand drains reserves faster. Faster drain invites bigger bets against the peg. No one actor caused the crisis. The architecture did once the anchor opted out. Could Britain have countered? Only by swapping vulnerability types, tighter controls to slow outflows, devaluation to reset parity, or fiscal austerity to signal orthodoxy. Each remedy carried political and economic pain, and none solved the core asymmetry. Oil and finance priced in dollars under US influence. The most elegant defense, secure an explicit US umbrella, required the one concession London wouldn't make while troops were advancing: stop. Modern echoes follow the same playbook. Cut access to swaps and clearing, hint to reinsurers, nudge commodity traders, and align messaging through multilateral fora. You don't need a blockade when you can raise the cost of moving money and matter. The target feels it not as a headline, but as a sudden scarcity of term funding, a spike in hedging costs, and a board meeting that ends with pause. That's how finance ends wars without firing shots. It shortens the runway until strategy has to rotate on the spot. The one lesson leaders miss: power is cash flowed. Okay, so here's the thing leaders keep missing. They plan for capacity, ships, jets, divisions, when the constraint is liquidity. Power is cash flowed. If you can't finance movement, your capability is theory. Suez is the clean case. Britain could seize terrain. It couldn't finance the external bill when the dollar window shut. Capacity is stock. Liquidity is flow. Wars drain flow. Most people think short wars are cheap. They're not if they expose long liabilities. Britain's liabilities were priced in dollars: oil, insurance, refinancing, and financed by confidence in sterling. The moment US support disappeared, every daily invoice arrived in a currency London didn't control. That's the blind spot. Leaders model ammunition consumption, not counterparty behavior. They count sorties, not forward points. Here's what actually happens when you mistake capacity for liquidity. You launch, win early, and declare limited objectives. But finance scales with uncertainty, not objectives. Insurers widen spreads because ambiguity lingers. Banks shorten tenors because headlines persist. Traders hedge more because timelines slip. Each defensive move by private actors turns into higher daily dollar demand on your side. Your operational restraint doesn't produce financial restraint. It produces a drip that becomes a drain. Narrative discipline can delay pressure, but it can't outvote balance sheets. Britain said police action and protecting navigation. Markets priced blocked channels and US disapproval. Leaders talk in principles. Markets translate into cash flow. That's why credibility lives in specific funded plans. How you'll pay for energy, how you'll roll debt, which central bank will co-sign. Without that, declarations are calories without protein. Measure power by who survives a sell-off, not who takes a city. Survival in modern crises means you can fund imports, roll short-term external liabilities, and keep domestic credit flowing while risk premia rise. Britain couldn't alone. The lesson isn't never act. It's pre-fund the act. Secure swap lines. Proclear reinsurance. Lock in term funding for energy. Build buffers bigger than your opponent's patience. Capacity versus liquidity also reframes timing. Strategists love speed of action. Finance cares about speed to certainty. If your lightning operation doesn't resolve into a stable end state that counterparties can underwrite, the funding environment worsens with each passing day. Britain's 7 days of military success raised financial ambiguity, not lowered it. Every hour stretched the question: what's the settlement? Who guarantees it? When do ships move? Without answers, discount widens. Now, you might be thinking, what if leaders accept some currency damage as the price of action? Fine, price it properly. That means scenario tables with stress on reserves, forward cover, and contingent liquidity. It means a pre-negotiated IMF path without political poison pills. It means energy allocations that don't depend on adversaries, goodwill, or a single choke point. It means legal and regulatory prep, so insurers can quote without waiting for Washington's nod. If any link relies on, they'll probably help. That's not a plan. That's a hope disguised as a spreadsheet. There's a cultural angle too. Institutions reward hardware wins. Balance sheet wins are invisible. Commanders get medals for airfields taken. No one gets a ribbon for swap lines secured. So the bias is baked in. Overinvest in steel, underinvest in liquidity. Suez flips the reward structure on its head. The decisive action happened off camera. Phone calls that released dollars. That felt soft. It was decisive. Close the loop with the call that ended Suez. It wasn't drama. It was accounting. Washington made the cash flow constraint visible. Britain understood that on current reserves, with oil priced higher and insurers reluctant, the glide path ran out before the political timetable did. Leaders who think in maps call that pressure. Leaders who think in ledgers call it math. Power is cash flowed. If you don't control the cash, you don't control the power. One takeaway: military gains collapse fast when the funding stream behind them snaps. If you want more war economics breakdowns like this, hit subscribe and keep going with the next episode, where we dissect another conflict settled by money, not missiles. Turn on notifications so you don't miss how modern power actually clears through ledgers, not headlines.